Welcome to PatsCast. Good to be with you. What should the Patriots do about Pop Douglas and Rhamondre Stevenson, two players that have been a grave disappointment so far 3 weeks into the season? I'm going to start with Pop Douglas because I think the Rhamondre conversation is a bit more nuanced than Douglas in the way that's been going. But look, we headed into this season, Josh McDaniels back as the offensive coordinator in New England, and I was so excited for DeMario Douglas. You have a guy who's coming off of two great seasons, his first 2 years in his career, and what I said about Josh McDaniels is he loves slot receivers. He knows how to use them. He knows how to move them around. He knows how to scheme it up so they can get open right away. Historically, with McDaniels and Brady and even Cam Newton and Mac Jones, they rely on that slot receiver position. It's a quick read, many quick slants, throws up the middle, a quick way for the quarterback to get rid of the football, particularly against the blitz. It is something that Josh McDaniels, the Patriots, have relied on for many, many years. And seeing the way DeMario Douglas played his first 2 years in the league, I thought he was really going to thrive in this offense. In 2023, Douglas's rookie year, he had almost 50 receptions, 561 yards, which led the team as a rookie, which is pretty astonishing considering he was in the Bill Belichick doghouse for a number of weeks after fumbling the football, still led the team in yards. And then his sophomore season, 66 receptions, 621 yards, and added 3 touchdowns to that. So I said, look, everything's in place right now for Pop Douglas to have 100 catches, 1,000 yards, maybe not 1,000, but 800 yards, very doable with the trajectory that his career was on, with an offensive coordinator like Josh McDaniels coming in, a guy that really knows how to use him. And he was my boom player heading into the season. He was the best receiver, arguably, throughout all of training camp, certainly the most consistent receiver. And I really thought he was going to take a big year 3 leap and become one of those reliable Patriot slot receivers that we've seen for so many years in the Josh McDaniels offense, a guy that you could put on your fantasy team because he's going to get 5, 6, 7 catches a game and could put up a few 100-yard plus performances. I really thought that's what we were going to see from Pop Douglas, and it just hasn't been the case at all. So far, 2025, he has 5 catches, 13 yards, and just 1 touchdown, which came on week 1 in a game where he actually had negative yardage because it was a goal line touchdown, and he lost yards on his other receptions. So 5 catches through 3 games, hasn't even cracked 20 yards at this point in time. DeMario Douglas we're going from him being considered the best receiver on this roster, especially with Stephon Diggs coming off of an ACL, to a guy that you don't even know if he should be on the team at this point. And perhaps it's a bit premature, right? We're 3 weeks into the season, and there's a lot this team needs to learn, and they had a kind of a weak training camp in the sense that Mike Vrabel didn't really push them very hard. He did that in Tennessee. He did that in New England. They hardly wore pads at all. They haven't even worn pads once in practices throughout the season. Now, I'm not sure that's really a big deal. Like, you're not having hard-hitting practices once the regular season starts, but Vrabel has been about conditioning and basically treating the first few weeks of the regular season similar to how Belichick and Brady did, where it was an experimental phase, and then once you hit weeks 5, 6, 7, then you start to understand your identity and implement a more consistent game plan. And perhaps that's what Vrabel's doing, and Douglas will, acclimate to this new offense and start to play a bit better. And maybe that will ultimately be what happens. But right now you have a team that has receivers that can't separate. They aren't, taking advantage of explosive vertical routes downfield. I mean, the Patriots are kind of running the old Josh McDaniels Brady offense where it's, death by 1,000 paper cuts, and then eventually you get into the end zone. But, you need consistency. You need a quarterback who's not going to turn over the football for that to happen. You need receivers that are going to get open. And even when they didn't have the most explosive receivers with Tom Brady, you still had Julian Edelman who could get open. You still had Gronk who could make plenty of explosive plays, plenty of yards after catch. All those receivers were good yards after catch guys. And, I thought DeMario Douglas would be that guy. I mean, he's fast. He's quick. He can create separation and get open. But clearly he's having trouble understanding this offense at this point. But I also think a lot of this falls on Drake May as well. And look, I'm very happy with Drake May. Obviously not happy about the turnovers in week 3 and in week 1. It's something he's had trouble with. He's continued to have trouble with. And, I'm going to give him some grace because he's 23 years old, and everything else he's done, learning the Josh McDaniels offense, getting in and out of the huddle, calling checks at the line, pointing out the mic pre-snap, doing all those things that Josh McDaniels asks his quarterbacks to do. He's doing a great job, and he brings a new element with that mobility and the, play actions, bootlegs, escaping edge rushers with his legs when the play breaks down. There's a lot that Drake May can do, so I think Drake May is on the right track. He obviously needs to limit the turnovers, but he has had some accuracy issues when throwing to DeMario Douglas that he hasn't really had with other players. Now, that isn't to say he hasn't had any accuracy issues at all. I mean, week 1, Drake May was overthrowing a lot of guys. I mean, he was overthrowing Mac Hollins, who's 6'4". Week 2, he almost overthrew Austin Hooper, who came down with a great catch, but had he not thrown it a foot above his head, probably would have been a touchdown. So when you take that into consideration, and then you look at DeMario Douglas, who's listed at 5'8", is probably really 5'6", he has a very small catch radius, and that's kind of a mismatch for Drake May, because he's a smaller target out there. And, we saw it during the preseason, we've seen it plenty in the regular season, that the two of them are just not on the same page. And Drake May often overthrows him, or throws behind him, or throws ahead of him. And it's hard to tell whether that's on DeMario Douglas. Is he not sitting in the zone like he should? He had that trouble last year with Drake May just not staying put, and Drake May would throw the ball behind him or ahead of him. Maybe that's on him, but also Drake May's got to be able to hit some of those smaller targets out there. And the chemistry just has never been there. It has never developed, right? I mean, I know he had 600 plus yards his second year, but a lot of that came when Jacoby Brissett was the quarterback. They seem to have a lot better connection than Drake May did with DeMario Douglas. Now, Drake May, he's great with Kayshon Boutte. He's been pretty good with Mac Hollins. I can't complain about his chemistry with Stephon Diggs. I'd love to see Stephon Diggs out there a little bit more, but, he's coming off of an ACL injury, and he's caught pretty much every catchable ball that's been thrown his way. You can't say the same about DeMario Douglas. So, what's coming out of the film? Like, what are we seeing from Douglas that isn't working out? Well, in week 1, his footwork was horrendous. It really was. Even on that touchdown reception, it was actually really just a great throw by Drake May. DeMario Douglas wasn't really even open, and a lot of that had to do with his footwork. Now, he didn't play much during week 2 against Miami. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact they were trying to establish the run, and when you do that, you need bigger receivers out there that are going to block, so you're going to give a lot more playing time to the Mac Hollins and the Kayshon Boutte's of the world, guys who can block, versus DeMario Douglas, who's just going to get knocked over. So he didn't play much week 2, and I understand why. But then week 3, it got even worse. Obviously the play that stands out was the 4th and 1 there. Patriots trying to tie the game, or, maybe they get a touchdown and go for 2 and try to win the game. And they had a 4th and 1 situation. I wouldn't say high red zone, but about 40-yard line. Threw it to DeMario Douglas. Instead of Douglas trying to surge forward, knife between the two defenders, he tried to step back and make a play a different way, and then a third defender caught up on him, and they weren't able to get past the first down line, and that was the ball game. So a lot of it is mental with DeMario Douglas. Certainly a lot of it's physical, right? I mean, there's a reason he was a mid to late 6th-round draft pick. I mean, Kayshon Boutte was drafted ahead of DeMario Douglas, who hardly played as a rookie. But Douglas, look, he was an impactful player as a rookie. He was an impactful player year 2, and now we're like, does he even have a spot on this roster going forward? And I'm really not sure what they should do, right? Because you have a number of receivers, a number of young receivers out there who are, looking to get some playing time. I mean, they drafted Kyle Williams in the early rounds, a guy who many considered potentially a first-round wide receiver. And he has speed, he can create separation, and he ran a great out route the other day, got wide open. Drake May found him for a 9-yard gain. There's a lot you can do with Kyle Williams. We just haven't really seen him out there. And for a receiving core that, Kayshon Boutte, is a good go-up-and-get-it vertical guy. He's actually pretty smart now at running the correct routes and understanding the Josh McDaniels offense, which I think was a bit of a surprise because he had trouble with the much more simplified Alex Van Pelt offense last year. But, he's doing his job. Kayshon Boutte. Mac Hollins is doing his job. DeMario Douglas just seems to be overthinking pre-snap, and maybe a lot of this just has to do with the offense. It has to do with the fact Drake May calls 2 plays at the line so he can check into a second play. DeMario Douglas maybe just doesn't have the mental load to be able to handle that. And if that's the case, then I don't think there ultimately is a fit for him. Maybe he needs to be in a more simplified offense like Alex Van Pelt ran last year, or like, even Bill O'Brien, which I think was a bit more complex, but DeMario Douglas thrived in that offense too. And I just think, for a guy who I thought was a smart receiver, he went to Liberty. They actually make you go to class at that school. I thought DeMario Douglas, if he was able to pick up on it as a rookie and a second-year player, thought he'd be able to pick up on the Josh McDaniels offense. Kayshon Boutte, I don't think is as sharp as DeMario Douglas, as I was saying. He picked up on it just fine. So I really don't know what's going on with him. It is a real mystery, but you have Kyle Williams, who's just waiting, dying to get some playing time out there. I think most NFL teams, had they drafted Kyle Williams in the position where they drafted him, he may not be in the starting lineup, but he'd be getting significantly more reps than he is in New England. And I know it's a crowded receiving room, but right now, you're just not getting guys that can separate outside of, Stephon Diggs occasionally, who's coming off of an ACL. Drake May's relying mostly on his tight ends, particularly Hunter Henry, who seems to lead the team in receiving every game, had 90 yards and 8 catches in week 3, but your tight ends aren't going to be key separators. Kayshon Boutte's not going to be that guy. Stephon Diggs probably not at this point in his career. DeMario Douglas is supposed to be that guy, and if he can't, well, you got Kyle Williams sitting there ready to go, a guy who can play on the outside, but played a lot in the slot at Washington State as well. So, he's a guy you can move around. Maybe a lot of it has to do with him being a rookie and struggling to pick up on the offense, but is it any worse than what DeMario Douglas has brought to the table so far? I'm not sure. But I think more importantly, there's also Efton Chisholm, who made the team after a really spectacular preseason, really spectacular training camp, caught every pass thrown his way essentially, and he hasn't been on the active roster through 3 weeks. I hope that changes this week, and not only is he dressed up and out there, he should be getting some actual reps in place of DeMario Douglas. Now, am I ready to say DeMario Douglas shouldn't play week 4? I'm not sure I'm quite ready to say that, but maybe you say, look, that role is going to be a 3-headed monster. It's going to be Douglas or Williams or Chisholm, and we're going to figure out who the best guy is, and everybody else stays in their roles, and then, let the best man win, ultimately. So I hope that's what ends up happening, but I said the Patriots should have done that last week. I said they should have done that the week before, and they're still going out there with Pop Douglas. He has a 2.6 yards per reception so far this season, and a 23% success rate. That's just not going to cut it. And the numbers in recent years have been, he's 5-6 yards per reception. I know he's kind of a slot guy, so he's not going to have big explosive plays all the time, but we expected a lot more for him. So, look, the Patriots have some options, right? You can stick with Douglas, trust his track record, and hope, through more reps, he'll develop more chemistry with Drake May, and he'll better understand the offense, and things will ultimately work out. And maybe that is the route to go. But, I think you can still do that while trying out some other receivers in the slot and seeing if they're going to bring a new spark to the offense. I really think Efton Chisholm can be a difference maker right away. I really, truly believe that. Now, maybe that's just preseason goggles that I'm putting on. There's certain players that, look more explosive. Travion Henderson, for instance, look very explosive against backups, third string, fourth string players in the preseason, gets out there against real NFL defenders and suddenly doesn't look as explosive. So maybe that would be the case with Efton Chisholm and same with Kyle Williams. But at this point, you're kind of running out of options because you need receivers who can separate. And more importantly, you need that slot guy who's going to be able to separate immediately and give Drake May a quick, short option, because I think the offensive line has been better than we've been expecting, but it's still not great. You need to be able to get rid of the football quickly. Teams are running lots of blitzes against the Patriots, And if Douglas isn't getting open in those situations, well, I know Chisholm probably isn't as fast as Douglas and certainly not as fast as Kyle Williams, but he's quick and can separate. I'd love to see him in that role a little bit more, or just in that role in general, because he hasn't been in it at all since the season started. You could also adjust the scheme to reduce some of the reliance on the slot receiver role, but that's not Josh McDaniels' MO. So, look, I think that is the solution, is you don't bench Douglas, you don't cut him, you don't do anything like that. We've only seen 3 games, new offensive coordinator, new head coach. Drake May is still essentially a rookie out there, didn't play a complete season last year. I think you stick with Douglas to an extent, maybe have him still start, but have Kyle Williams out there a lot more in that role and bring Efton Chisholm out there, because they need a spark on offense and they're missing it, because that is such an important part of the Josh McDaniels offense. And look, it's working with the tight ends. It always worked with the tight ends with Josh McDaniels, especially once Gronk was on the team. But it's not working out so far with the slot guys. Or you just play Stephon Diggs a little bit more in that slot role. I mean, he could do that job just fine. But I'd love to see more opportunities there for the young guys, just to see if they can add that spark at this point. But then Rhamondre Stevenson is also a huge issue. Now, Michael Felger on Monday was talking about, I don't want running backs that fumble the football. I just don't. It's the most interchangeable position on the field, which I agree with. And if you're fumbling the football consistently, cut him out. You should cut him right now. I don't agree with that. I don't think they should be cutting Rhamondre Stevenson at this point in time. And Mike Vrabel said after the game, quote, "We're going to need him. We're going to need everybody. He's got talent, skill set. He's a good protector. We trust him in protection, and we'll get through this." I think a lot of it is just consistency and continuing to build confidence, but you have to go out there and do it. So, I don't think Mike Vrabel has any intention of pulling Rhamondre Stevenson or benching him, at least in week 4 against Carolina. I think we're going to see him out there. We saw Rhamondre out there, I believe, even after the second fumble, although I think he was in there more to block and less to actually run the football. They leaned a little bit more on TreVeyon Henderson. But look, this is a real problem, right? There's been 3 Patriots since 2005 that have had 3 fumble seasons. Lawrence Maroney, LeGarrette Blount, and Stephen Ridley. Rhamondre Stevenson had 7 last year. So those are 3 fumble seasons. He had 7 last year. And now he's 1 fumble away from having a back-to-back 3+ fumble season. So we knew what would happen with Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick bench players because they fumble. I was talking about Pop Douglas a minute ago. He was very impactful first couple weeks of the season as a rookie, and then he got stripped from behind and then sat on the bench for a few weeks because Belichick was so pissed about it. He would not tolerate this. Now, I think Mike Vrabel has a very different approach. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact he was a player himself. He understands that, staying consistent and, people are going to make mistakes, right? People are going to fumble the football. The best players in the world still fumble the football at times. Derrick Henry fumbled it on Monday Night Football last night. So, it happens. I think he's going to be a little bit more patient with Rhamondre Stevenson, but 7 fumbles last year, and he's close to getting his 3rd already 4 weeks into the season. I mean, that's just not going to cut it. It really is not going to cut it. And I think a lot of Patriots fans think the solution is take TreVeyon Henderson and just make him your every down back. Play him like Mike Vrabel played Derrick Henry in Tennessee. And I'm going to tell you right now, that's not going to work. That is not going to work. He's not that type of player. He wasn't even that type of player at Ohio State. In fact, the other running back on Ohio State was drafted ahead of TreVeyon Henderson, even though I think Henderson is the better back. He's a guy who, I wouldn't call him a 3rd down back. He can be an every down back, but he shouldn't be an every play back, if you know what I mean. Like, you can put him in on 1st down, have him run between the tackles. I think he's a better fit at this point in his career as a 3rd down, pass-catching, blocking type back. But, so far this season, TreVeyon Henderson has kind of struggled a little bit. He averaged 2.5 yards a carry in week 3 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And like I said, he was very dominant, very explosive. We saw that acceleration throughout the preseason. The second he gets out there against starting NFL defensive linemen, he can't run between the tackles quite as effectively. And one of the big praises of TreVeyon Henderson coming out of college is he is an NFL-ready blocker, right? And we saw it during the preseason. He's an excellent blocker, but that just hasn't been the case. And I think that's part of the reason we're still seeing Rhamondre Stevenson out there quite a bit, because Stevenson so far has been a better blocker during the regular season than TreVeyon Henderson. Henderson's been run over a number of times, and maybe a lot of that has to do with his size, which is concerning because maybe that means Henderson ultimately won't be an effective NFL blocker. So I don't think that's the solution. I think a good happy medium, and I know he fumbled the other day as well, but Antonio Gibson, you have him out there as your starting power running back. You still play Stevenson a little bit, but you play Henderson a little bit more. You have Antonio Gibson out there as your starter, and then you go from there and you mix in LeGarrette Blount. You mix in Rhamondre Stevenson at times. But look, Mike Vrabel was asked about ball security, specifically talking about Rhamondre Stevenson. He said, we've got to continue to practice the crap out of it. We also have to do a better job of protecting said person with the ball, whether that's the quarterback, whether that's the running back or the receiver. We're all responsible for the security of the football. It starts with the person who has it, and then it falls on the people who are blocking. Okay, obviously that makes sense. It's a team sport, and you have to. Ball security is more than just the guy holding the football. But, and this was a point Tom Curran made the other day, that hasn't been the issue with Rhamondre Stevenson. It hasn't been defensive players, stripping the ball out from him where he doesn't see them in his peripheral vision. No, it's been Rhamondre Stevenson going to the ground, ending the play that he's losing the football. And look, I didn't play football, right? Like I ran cross country. My high school was so small, I didn't even have a football team. But high school kids, middle school kids understand ball security. You don't see running backs in high school constantly fumbling the football when they're going to the ground. And that's the issue with Rhamondre Stevenson. The majority of his fumbles last year were that. It wasn't some player stripping it out from behind. It was Rhamondre Stevenson going into traffic, one hand, going to the ground, and then he loses the football. Now, the defensive players, of course, have something to do with that, but I think this is fixable. Shouldn't it be fixable? Just put two arms around the football when you're going down with it. I mean, he had an easy touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers and then fumbled it in the end zone, and there really wasn't a ton of contact when he lost the football at that point. There was contact before he lost the football, and Rhamondre powered through it, but it was when he was going to the ground that the ball came loose. And I think that's something that should be very fundamental and fixable in the NFL. And I'm not going to say cut Rhamondre Stevenson at this point if it is that fixable, right? But obviously this is a recurring problem when he has 9 fumbles through, 18, 19 games, 20 games? Obviously that's not going to cut it. But even last week, Rhamondre Stevenson was very impactful out there. He was second on the team in receiving yards. Running back, Rhamondre Stevenson, who we didn't see as a pass catcher for so long. He was second on the team in receiving yards last week. He was still averaging 4.5 yards per carry, which led the team. Antonio Gibson had 4 yards per carry. TreVeyon Henderson, as I mentioned, had 2.5. And then look at the game in Miami. It was really a career game for Rhamondre Stevenson. 5 catches, 88 yards, which led the team in receiving. And he also had 54 yards on the ground and 11 carries, 122 yards total on the ground. Now 31 of those came from Drake May, but they were platooning the running backs at that point, and Stevenson was very effective in that game. I really did think that was the best game of his career. So obviously it was the most demoralizing, embarrassing game of Rhamondre's career, week 3. But are you going to cut him after that, after coming off of week 2 where he had the best game of his career, in my opinion? No, I don't think you do that. So, look, maybe you do bench him. Maybe you do bench him week 4 against Carolina just to kind of send a message, and you continue to work with him on just holding onto the football, going to the ground, very basic stuff. But this team just does not have the luxury of sitting players. They just don't have the talent. And maybe they have a bit more talent at the running back position, but I don't consider Antonio Gibson to be a power back. I certainly don't consider TreVeyon Henderson to be that guy. So Rhamondre is really the only guy you got on 4th and 1 third and 1, goal line situations, that's, if the blocking doesn't work out the way it should, he's still going to be able to power his way through and get into the end zone or get the first down. You have to stick with him, right? Like, there just aren't free agents that you're going to be able to sign at this point. I think they still have that Montgomery guy on the practice squad. He's not going to cut it. So you're not going to find a real power back that's going to be able to play that role. And more importantly, he's the best blocking running back on the team right now. Gibson hasn't been great. Henderson's been a disappointment in that department. You have to keep him in that role just for that alone. And the fact that he's turned into a pretty good pass-catching back. So, look, they got to clean this up. Again, last 18 games, he has 8 fumbles. The 3 years before that, Rhamondre Stevenson only had 4 total fumbles. So, he led the league in the NFL last year in fumbles. Most of that came going to the ground. I don't know. I'm not sure what to do. Stevenson said himself, he was asked about it, whether it was mental or physical. He said, I don't know, but I'm going to do both. I'm going to practice physically and try to get it out of my head mentally. So, I do think it's technique. It's mindset. Maybe he's just losing focus at the end of the play. There's a lot going on when you have 350-pound defensive tackles surrounding you, trying to bring you to the ground, and maybe that is a bit of a distraction. But, look, this is an NFL veteran running back. They signed him to a lot of money, not just this season, but for next season as well. That doesn't make any sense to cut him. I'm sure, Mike Vrabel turned over, 2/3 of this roster? I'm sure he would have loved to find a different running back than Rhamondre Stevenson, but they had so much money tied up in there. And he still is a really good player, and he is the type of player, we saw what Vrabel did with Derrick Henry. He is the type of player that Mike Vrabel likes. So, look, we know he's talented. He's obviously turnover prone. I think Vrabel's going to be a bit more patient than certainly most Patriots fans and the Boston media are going to be, but I'm much more of a fan of sitting Pop Douglas than I am at Rhamondre Stevenson at this point, because at the very least, despite the fumbles, Rhamondre Stevenson has been quite productive this season, and you can't say the same thing about Pop Douglas. But curious to hear from you. Let me know what you think the Patriots should do with DeMario Douglas, with the wide receiver core, what they should do with Rhamondre Stevenson. Should he be benched this next week? Are you in the department that you should just cut him? You should never running back that fumbles the football. I get that argument, but Henderson's been a disappointment, and Gibson, I don't think Gibson is a reliable primary back every day. So that's really it. You have to look at the situation. But let me know if you disagree in the comments below. And if you're watching on YouTube and you like this video, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, or subscribe if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'll be back very soon with more New England Patriots coverage.